When the Silverwood pack hurled a bride in torn white silk past their iron gates and into the howling blizzard, they believed they were merely burying a dark secret. Instead, their ruthless cruelty during that brutal frost of 1482 didn't just turn the pack's heart to ice, it awakened a slumbering king. The grand hall of Silverwood Castle was heavy with the scent of pine, roasted meats, and the suffocating perfume of the high nobility. Beatrice Hawthorne stood trembling at the altar, her slender frame drowning in layers of heavy, pearl-encrusted white silk. She was an Omega, the youngest daughter of the impoverished Hawthorne family, sold into a political marriage to settle her father's gambling debts and secure the northern borders. Her intended was Conrad Sterling, the golden-haired heir to the Silverwood pack, an alpha whose reputation for cruelty was eclipsed only by his vanity. Beatrice kept her eyes downcast, a picture of perfect obedience. This was the survival mechanism of an Omega in a world ruled by fangs and brute strength. Beside her, Conrad stood stiffly, his jaw clenched tight. He hadn't looked at her once. "Do you, Conrad of House Sterling, accept this Omega as your bonded mate, to protect and lead under the light of the ancestors?" intoned Silas, the high priest, his voice echoing off the ancient stone walls. A heavy, oppressive silence fell over the hall. Beatrice felt a sudden, sharp spike in the air, the metallic tang of an alpha's pheromones turning sour with aggression. She looked up, her heart hammering against her ribs. Conrad turned to her, his eyes flashing a vivid, predatory gold, but there was no warmth in them, only a calculated disgust. "I do not." Conrad's voice rang out, sharp as a cracked whip. The collective gasp from the 400 guests sucked the air from the room. Beatrice stumbled back a step, the heavy silk of her dress suddenly feeling like a shroud. "Conrad." "My lord, please," she whispered, the panic rising in her throat. A rejected mating ceremony was not merely a social embarrassment. For an Omega, it was a death sentence. It stripped them of all pack protection, marking them as defective goods. "I will not bind my bloodline to a barren, deceitful creature," Conrad declared, turning to face the whispering crowd. From the shadows of the arched doorway, a woman stepped forward. It was Rosalie Sinclair, the daughter of the pack's lead general. She was draped in crimson velvet, her chin held high, and her hand resting ostentatiously on the slight swell of her belly. "The Hawthorne family sought to trick us," Conrad's father, Lord Arthur Sterling, boomed from the high table. "They offered us an Omega with tainted blood, hiding the fact that she carries the wasting sickness. She is unfit to bear the Sterling name. We have found a true mate for my son." It was a lie. A brilliant, devastating lie. Beatrice was perfectly healthy, but she understood the politics of the pack instantly. Rosalie had managed to get pregnant by Conrad out of wedlock. To avoid a scandal and secure the general's loyalty, the Sterlings needed to dispose of their legal obligation to the Hawthorns. What better way than to frame the Hawthorne bride as defective? "No!" Beatrice cried out, finding her voice. "That is a lie! My father—" Before she could finish, Conrad's hand shot out, striking her across the face with the force of a brute. The impact threw Beatrice to the stone floor, her lips splitting open, the taste of copper flooding her mouth. "Silence, Omega," Conrad snarled, his fangs extending slightly. "You are stripped of your bridal rights. You are stripped of your pack scent. You are a rogue." Two massive palace guards stepped forward at Arthur's nod. They seized Beatrice by her arms, dragging her up from the cold floor. She kicked and thrashed, but her Omega strength was nothing against fully grown alpha warriors. "Take her to the boundaries," Conrad ordered, turning his back on her to take Rosalie's hand. "Let the winter claim her." They dragged her through the long, torchlit corridors of the keep, her pleas echoing into the stone and going entirely unanswered. The guests simply watched, their eyes filled with either pity or morbid fascination. No one moved to help her. In the hierarchy of the wolves, the alpha's word was absolute law. The heavy iron gates of the castle groaned open, revealing the howling black maw of the midnight blizzard. The wind was a physical force, screaming through the trees of the surrounding forest. The guards didn't just escort her out. They hauled her to the very edge of the pack's territorial ward, a sheer drop-off into the unmapped wilderness known as the Black Peaks. With a violent shove, they threw her forward. Beatrice tumbled down the steep, snow-covered embankment, the delicate silk of her dress tearing on hidden rocks and thorns. She landed in a deep snowdrift, the icy wetness instantly biting into her skin. Above her, standing at the edge of the torchlight, one of the guards sneered. "Don't bother trying to walk back. The perimeter guards have orders to shoot you on sight." The heavy gate slammed shut in the distance. The torches faded. Beatrice was left in total darkness, miles from civilization, wearing nothing but torn silk in a storm that could freeze a grown man to death in hours. For a long time she just lay there, the shock numbing the pain of her bruised face. The cold was a living, breathing monster, gnawing at her fingers and toes, seeping deep into her bones. "I am going to die here," she thought, the realization settling over her with a strange, heavy calmness. They threw me away like garbage, but as the numbness crept closer to her heart, a tiny, defiant spark ignited within her. It was the survival instinct of an animal backed into a corner. She forced herself onto her hands and knees. The snow was up to her thighs, and every movement was an agony of shivering muscles. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stay still. Beatrice dragged herself through the knee-deep powder, the howling wind drowning out her ragged gasps. Hours bled into one another. Her vision began to blur, the edges of the dark forest turning into a hazy, swirling white. The fatal warmth of hypothermia began to set in. She stopped shivering. The snow beneath her suddenly felt like a soft, inviting featherbed. Just a moment's rest, she thought, her eyes drooping shut as she collapsed at the base of a massive, ancient pine tree. Just for a moment. The silence of the deep woods was profound, broken only by the crack of freezing timber. Beatrice drifted in the space between life and death, her breathing incredibly shallow. Then, the snow crunched. It wasn't the light, skittering sound of a deer. It was heavy, deliberate. The crunch of massive paws breaking the frozen crust of the earth. Beatrice forced her heavy eyelids open. Through the blurring snow, a shadow detached itself from the darkness of the trees. It was a wolf, but of a size that defied logic. It stood easily as tall as a draft horse at the shoulder, its fur a thick, ragged mixture of obsidian and charcoal. Scars crisscrossed its massive snout, and its eyes burned with an unnatural, piercing crimson light. It was a monstrous beast of the old legends, a dire wolf. Beatrice couldn't even muster the energy to be afraid. She just watched the creature approach, waiting for it to tear out her throat and end her misery. The giant wolf stepped over her shivering body, its massive head lowering. She felt the hot, damp blast of its breath against her freezing cheek. The wolf inhaled deeply, taking in her scent. Suddenly, the beast recoiled, a low, rumbling growl vibrating in its chest. It wasn't a growl of hunger. It was a growl of absolute fury. Before her fading eyes, the silhouette of the wolf began to warp and shift. The agonizing crack of bones rearranging echoed through the clearing. In the span of a few heartbeats, the beast was gone, replaced by the towering figure of a man. He was entirely naked to the freezing wind, completely unfazed by the sub-zero temperatures. He was heavily muscled, his skin marked with the same jagged scars that had marred the wolf's snout. Long, dark hair whipped around a face that was brutally handsome, yet hardened by years of suffering. But it was his aura that struck Beatrice the hardest. It was an alpha presence so suffocatingly powerful that it made Conrad Sterling feel like a whimpering pup. The man knelt beside her, his large, rough hands gently brushing the snow from her face. His skin was radiating a furnace-like heat. "Who did this to you?" His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone, rough from disuse. Beatrice tried to speak, but her lips were blue and cracked. Only a faint wheeze escaped her throat. The man cursed under his breath. He didn't ask another question. Without hesitation, he shrugged off the heavy, fur-lined bearskin cloak he carried slung over one massive shoulder and wrapped it tightly around her trembling form. Then, he scooped her up into his arms as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. "Hold on, little bird," he murmured, his chest rumbling against her ear. "Come with me. I have you." Beatrice lost consciousness, succumbing to the overwhelming cedar and wood smoke scent of the strange alpha. When she awoke, the agonizing bite of the cold was gone, replaced by a searing, painful heat returning to her extremities. She was lying on a massive bed draped in thick animal pelts. The room was cavernous, built of rough-hewn stone and massive timber beams. A gigantic fire roared in a hearth large enough to roast a whole ox. She bolted upright, panic flaring, but a sharp pain in her ribs made her gasp. "Drink this." Slowly. She turned to see the man from the woods, sitting in a high-backed wooden chair near the fire. He was dressed now, wearing dark leather breeches and a simple, unlaced tunic that did nothing to hide the heavy scarring across his chest. He held out a steaming clay mug. Beatrice hesitated, pulling the furs up to her chin. "Where am I? Who are you?" The man stood, his sheer size dominating the room. He moved with a predatory grace, closing the distance between them. He offered the mug again. "You are in the fortress of Ironhold, deep in the Black Peaks," he said, his crimson eyes locking onto hers. "As for who I am, I suppose the Silverwood Pack calls me the Mad King. My name is Alaric Montgomery." Beatrice's breath hitched, the mug trembling as she finally took it from his hands. Alaric Montgomery. The name was a ghost story used to frighten pups. He was the former Alpha King of the United Northern Territories, overthrown in a bloody coup led by Arthur Sterling 3 years ago. The stories said Alaric had gone feral, slaughtering his own court before being driven into exile in the unforgiving mountains. You're supposed to be dead," she whispered. A dark, bitter smile touched Alaric's lips. "Arthur Sterling always was a terrible liar. But tell me, Omega, why did the Honorable Lord Sterling throw a bride into my woods to freeze?" Haltingly, fighting through tears and the lingering shock, Beatrice told him everything. The arranged marriage, Conrad's sudden rejection, the public humiliation, and the lie about her being barren and diseased so they could legitimize Rosalie's bastard child. As she spoke, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Alaric's jaw ticked, his hands gripping the back of a wooden chair so tightly the timber groaned and splintered under his grip. "They called you barren?" Alaric asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal whisper. "They threw you out because they claimed you were defective?" "Yes." Beatrice looked down at her hands. "An Omega without a pack. I have no value." Alaric stepped forward, suddenly grabbing her chin and forcing her to look up at him. His touch was rough, yet surprisingly gentle. He leaned in, closing his eyes as he inhaled the scent at the crook of her neck. "They didn't throw you out because you are defective, Beatrice," Alaric said, his eyes opening, blazing with a terrifying intensity. "They threw you out because they were terrified of what you are." What do you mean?" "I have not been near an Omega in 3 years," Alaric growled softly. "But my senses are not dull. You do not smell of a common Omega. Beneath the fear and the cold, your blood sings with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and ancient earth. You are a latent vessel of the first bloodline." Beatrice stared at him, uncomprehending. "The old lore," Alaric explained, his voice tight. "Only an Omega of the first bloodline can carry the true heir of an Alpha King. The Sterlings didn't just want to marry Rosalie. Their seers must have realized what you were. If Conrad mated with you, your offspring would possess a claim to the throne stronger than the Sterling name itself. They couldn't murder you outright without starting a war with the Hawthorne territory, so they publicly shamed you and left you to the elements to die." The magnitude of the betrayal washed over Beatrice. Her father hadn't just sold her. The Sterlings had orchestrated an assassination disguised as a scandal. Before Beatrice could process the revelation, a frantic howling echoed from the valley below the fortress. It was a sharp, military cadence. Alaric's head snapped toward the heavy wooden shutters. His eyes flared a brilliant, glowing red. "It seems," Alaric said, his voice turning ice cold, "that Lord Sterling didn't trust the winter to finish the job. His scouts have tracked your scent." Beatrice's heart stopped. "They'll kill us. They'll kill me to keep the secret. And they'll kill you to finish the coup." Alaric walked over to the hearth. Above the mantel rested a massive, double-edged broadsword, gleaming in the firelight. He lifted it effortlessly with one hand. When he turned back to Beatrice, the man was gone. In his place stood the exiled king, a terrifying apex predator ready for war. "Let them try," Alaric snarled, a savage grin spreading across his face. "Rest now, little bird. The true king of the north is about to send Conrad Sterling a wedding gift." The valley beneath the fortress echoed with the rhythmic, crunching footfalls of the Pinkerton Trackers, a notorious private mercenary guild hired by Lord Arthur Sterling. They were ruthless hunters, men who carried heavy broadswords forged from Winchester steel, known across the Northern Territories for taking down rogue alphas. Conrad hadn't just sent scouts. He had paid a fortune to ensure Beatrice's corpse was found and Alaric's legend remained buried. Inside the stone walls of Ironhold, Alaric Montgomery rolled his broad shoulders. The heavy, double-edged sword in his grip hummed as he channeled his alpha energy, the runes etched into the blade glowing a faint, menacing amber. "Stay by the hearth, Beatrice," Alaric commanded. his voice a low, vibrating rumble that sent a strange, involuntary shiver of warmth down her spine. Do not look out the window. What happens next is not for an Omega's eyes. The blood of kings is not measured by the crowns they wear, but by the wolves they slaughter to protect their own. Old Northern proverb. Beatrice clutched the heavy bearskin cloak to her chest, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her bruised ribs. She watched as Alaric strode out into the howling blizzard, the heavy oak doors slamming shut behind him. Outside, the storm masked the exact numbers of the Pinkerton mercenaries, but the heavy scent of wet dog, cheap ale, and iron seeped through the cracks in the stone walls. Then, the screaming began. It wasn't the roar of a battle. It was the sheer, unadulterated terror of a massacre. Beatrice heard the distinct, horrifying snap of Winchester steel shattering, followed by the wet tear of flesh and the agonizing shrieks of hardened killers begging for mercy. The blizzard seemed to amplify the sounds of the Mad King reclaiming his title. Through it all, Alaric did not make a single sound, no roar, no battle cry. He killed with the chilling, silent efficiency of an apex predator. Within 10 minutes, the screaming stopped. The only sound left was the whistling wind. When the oak doors groaned open again, Alaric stepped inside. He was entirely drenched in crimson, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a blinding, feral red light. He dropped the severed head of the Pinkerton captain, a brute named Garrick, onto the stone floor. It rolled to a stop near the fire. I left one alive, Alaric rasped, his fangs still fully extended, dripping with blood. I told him to ride back to Silverwood and inform Arthur Sterling that the Mad King has claimed his bride. Beatrice stared at him, expecting to feel terror at the sight of this blood-soaked monster. Instead, as Alaric's burning gaze met hers, something ancient and dormant within her snapped awake. It started as a fever deep in her blood. The bruises on her face began to fade, her pale skin flushing with a sudden radiant heat. The scent of pine and roasted meat that clung to her from Silverwood vanished, entirely replaced by an overpowering, intoxicating fragrance of night-blooming jasmine, crushed cedar, and rich, rain-soaked earth. Alaric froze, the bloodlust draining from his eyes, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated awe. He dropped his sword, the heavy metal clattering loudly against the stone. The awakening, he breathed, falling to his knees before her. Beatrice gasped, clutching her chest as a surge of pure, unbridled power flooded her veins. She was no longer the subservient, frightened creature who had kept her eyes downcast at the altar. She was an Omega of the first bloodline, and her biology was finally recognizing its true mate. The awakening of the first bloodline brought forth 3 forgotten truths of the wolf hierarchy. Asterisk, the scent of command. Unlike standard Omegas who submit to Alphas, a first bloodline Omega's scent can forcibly pacify and command any Alpha save for her destined mate. Asterisk, the Alpha's anchor. By bonding with her, an Alpha King's strength is magnified tenfold, anchoring his feral instincts and granting him absolute clarity in battle. Asterisk, the Earth's blessing. The territory itself responds to her fertility and health, meaning the freezing, barren lands of the north would finally thaw under her reign. Beatrice, Alaric whispered, crawling closer until he rested his bloodied forehead against her knees. My queen. My mate. Beatrice reached out, her trembling fingers tangling in his dark, blood-matted hair. The moment her skin touched his, a visible shockwave of golden energy pulsed outward from their bodies. It blew the shutters open, shattering the icicles on the roof and sending a blast of warm, fragrant air sweeping down the mountain, straight toward the heart of Silverwood. We are not hiding, Beatrice said, her voice dropping an octave, ringing with a newfound absolute authority. We are going back, and we are going to take everything from them. 2 days later, the grand hall of Silverwood Castle was once again packed with the high nobility. The mood, however, was far from celebratory. The unnatural wave of warm air that had swept through the territory had melted the winter snows overnight, turning the roads to mud and sending a primal panic through the pack. Furthermore, the lone, traumatized Pinkerton mercenary had returned, babbling about the Mad King and a scent that drove men to their knees. Arthur Sterling stood at the head table, his face pale and drawn, trying to maintain order as Conrad paced nervously. Rosalie sat nearby, clutching her swollen belly, her arrogant sneer replaced by a mask of deep anxiety. "It is a trick," Conrad shouted to the murmuring crowd. "Alaric is dead. The Hawthorne bitch died in the snow. We have nothing to fear." As if the ancestors themselves wished to prove him wrong, the massive, reinforced steel doors of the grand hall exploded inward. The heavy oak and iron shrapnel tore through the room, pinning 2 guards to the stone pillars. The crowd erupted into terrified screams, scrambling backward as the dust cleared to reveal 2 figures standing in the archway. Alaric Montgomery stood tall, dressed in midnight black armor, the massive broadsword resting effortlessly on his shoulder. His presence alone was a suffocating weight that forced the weaker alphas in the room to drop to their hands and knees, gasping for breath. But it was the woman beside him who stole the air from the room. Beatrice Hawthorne wore a gown of deep, sweeping crimson velvet, the color of an Alpha King's mate. Her hair fell in dark, luxurious waves, and her eyes held a terrifying, radiant gold light. The scent of jasmine and earth rolled off her in heavy, intoxicating waves, completely neutralizing the aggressive pheromones of the Silverwood guards. "Lord Sterling," Alaric's voice boomed, echoing like thunder in a canyon. "You are sitting in my chair." "Kill him!" Arthur shrieked, drawing his own sword. "Guards! Tear him apart!" A dozen heavily armed alpha warriors rushed forward, their fangs bared. But before Alaric could even swing his blade, Beatrice stepped in front of him. She didn't raise a weapon. She merely looked at the charging guards and released a concentrated burst of her omega pheromones. "Kneel," Beatrice commanded. It wasn't a request. It was a biological imperative. The guards hit an invisible wall of pure dominance. Their eyes widened in shock as their knees buckled, their weapons clattering to the floor. They pressed their foreheads to the stone, whining in utter submission to the first bloodline. Conrad backed away, his face entirely drained of blood. No, it's impossible. You're a defective, barren Omega. You're nothing." "I am the North," Beatrice replied, her voice eerily calm as she walked slowly down the center aisle, the crowd parting for her like the Red Sea. "You threw me to the wolves, Conrad. You should have known I would come back leading the pack." Arthur Sterling, seeing his guards neutralized and his reign crumbling, let out a desperate feral roar. He shifted mid-leap, turning into a massive, gray-furred wolf, and launched himself directly at Beatrice's throat. He never made it halfway. Alaric moved with a speed that defied physics. He intercepted the giant gray wolf in mid-air, his hand clamping around Arthur's throat like a vice of solid iron. Without shifting, Alaric slammed the usurper into the stone floor so hard the foundation of the castle trembled. With one brutal, sickening twist, Alaric snapped Arthur Sterling's neck. The gray wolf went limp. The hall fell into a terrifying, absolute silence. Alaric stood over the dead usurper, his red eyes locking onto Conrad. The golden-haired prince, the cruel alpha who had ordered Beatrice's death, fell to his knees, a dark stain spreading across the front of his trousers. He was weeping openly. "Please," Conrad begged, his voice cracking. "Mercy, take the throne. Just let me live." Alaric looked at Beatrice, deferring the judgment to his queen. Beatrice stared down at the man who had humiliated her, who had struck her and thrown her into a blizzard to die to cover up his own sins. She looked at Rosalie, who was cowering behind a chair, sobbing hysterically. "Strip him of his name," Beatrice ordered, her voice echoing with finality. "Strip them both of their pack scent, brand them as rogues, and throw them out the iron gates. Let us see how long the Honorable Conrad Sterling survives in the Black Peaks without a cloak." The poetic justice of the sentence sent a shudder through the remaining nobility. No one dared to speak. No one dared to challenge her. Alaric smiled, a genuine, fiercely proud expression. He extended his hand to her. Beatrice took it, allowing him to lead her up the stone steps to the high table. As they turned to face the hundreds of kneeling wolves, Alaric dropped to one knee himself, taking Beatrice's hand and pressing his lips to her knuckles in front of the entire kingdom. The Mad King had returned, but he was no longer a monster of the wilderness. He was the sword, and Beatrice Hawthorne was the hand that wielded him. The winter of 1482 began with a bride thrown into the frost and ended with a queen seated upon a throne of iron and pine. Beatrice Hawthorne, the rejected Omega, became the mother of a new dynasty. Beside her stood Alaric, the exiled king tamed only by her touch. They ruled not by fear, but by the unbreakable bond of the first bloodline, forever changing the North.